Is the Sony 50mm f1.2 G Master the best lens for weddings and portraits? I would say yes. To be 100% honest with you, before I got this lens, I'm not sure you could convince me of that. The 50mm focal length was never really of much interest to me. I always thought it was kind of, just kind of like a boring focal length. If you caught me a couple years ago, I would have probably normally pulled out my 35mm, 85mm. Either one of those two lenses was like my go-to, probably mostly 35mm. I did own the Sony 55mm f1.8 lens, and while that was an awesome lens, I just never found myself pulling it out too much. But once I got my hands on this lens, I literally couldn't put it down. After spending about a year and a half with it, I can easily say that this is my go-to lens for wedding photography and portraits. 50mm is a really versatile focal length. It can be used for pretty much everything that's thrown at me on a wedding day. Flat lays, reception details, portraits, documentary stuff, you name it, I'm using my 50mm. I mean, literally, I'm using this thing for like 80% of a wedding day. The build quality is really good. Their G Master line of lenses is always top-notch quality. Sony's prime lenses in particular are known for their good optics as well. It is definitely going to excel in lack of chromatic aberration, and especially the 50mm length. It's not going to have much distortion at all compared to like a 24 or even a 35. You've got to be pretty careful even with the 35mm when you get up close with distortion and all that. And with the 50mm, it's just not something you really have to worry about. Of course, with that f1.2 aperture, you are going to get a really shallow depth of field, which is also going to double as a really good low light lens, which if you are in wedding photography at all, you know that you are going to deal with these situations. Being knowledgeable in flash obviously helps, but sometimes there are those situations that call for just kind of ambient light and working with what you've got. And having that f1.2 aperture is definitely going to save you from having to raise your ISO up. If you were using, for instance, an f2 lens or an f2.8 lens or even f4, that's definitely going to hurt you. So that's definitely a big advantage to having that f1.2 aperture. Of course, as I mentioned, you are going to get that really nice, creamy bokeh background. This lens has really, really nice fall off. It's very cinematic. It's really nice, very, very pleasing. That was one of the main things that kind of brought me towards using this lens so much, was it's just so pleasing to the eye. The fall off, the sharpness, you can get that with other lenses, but I found that this lens in particular, I don't know if it's just my copy or what, but this thing has just the best look I've ever seen in any lens I've ever used. It really has those cinematic characteristics. What I mean by that is that it's sharp, and it is a very sharp lens, even wide open, but it also gives a really great look to skin tones, a nice natural kind of creamy-ish look. And as I mentioned before, the fall off is really, really nice. As I mentioned earlier, I have owned the 55mm f1.8 lens, which is a fantastic, lightweight, fairly cheap lens, and I would definitely recommend it for someone who's more in the budget range. But if you can splurge on this 50mm, I'm telling you right now, you are not going to regret it. Really, the only cons with this lens are obviously the price. It's a little bit on the expensive side. It is rather large and heavy compared to the 35, the 24, which are really nice compact lenses. But for the optical performance you are going to get out of this lens, I think it's an easy trade-off, especially for me and how much I use it. So those are my thoughts on using this 50mm lens for wedding photography. I think it is great. I think it is literally the best lens out there right now for Sony that you could use for wedding photography. But of course, that is just my opinion. Appreciate you guys stopping by to watch the video. I hope it was helpful. See you guys in the next one. Peace.